Transportation, tragedy, tradition. The foundations of British Columbia's history. Hello, I'm Malcolm Stewart. Today on BC Moments from Knowledge Network, we'll hark back to when stagecoaches, trains, and steamships penetrated the mountains and coastlines to develop our industries and towns. We'll see how that pioneering spirit was undaunted by devastating fires or war. We'll discover how tradition keeps our history alive and how some communities make modern history. As the province farthest from Europe, BC lags a couple of centuries behind Eastern Canada in its history of exploration and immigration. Our history is so new that BC is still known as a last frontier. Maybe the gold rushes of the 1800s aren't over, that the best is yet to come. We've got one town, in fact, up in the old Caribou goldfields that hasn't even noticed the 20th century has come and gone.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Barkerville.
Hard to believe so lively a place was almost a ghost town before Barkerville decided it was better off in the past than the future. Now, it's like the old days again. Of course, it's not all dancing in the streets at Barkerville. There's singing in the streets as well.
1, 2, 3, 4, I got a gal and she loves me.
Well, it's not all singing and dancing in the streets. There's plenty more inside. Since it was designated an historic provincial park in 1958, Barkerville has lived perpetually in the past. More than 120 heritage buildings have been restored or reconstructed to represent the town's most illustrious era, 1869 to the early 1900s. Interpreters and actors from the 19th century mingle with visitors who come for a taste of life in a genuine gold rush town. They stroll the boardwalks and streets, chatting with newcomers, captivating crowds with music and stories from Barkerville's heyday. That's when the town was the social and economic hub of the Caribou region, and the gold mines here were a source of wealth for the frontier province of British Columbia. Barkerville, 90 kilometers east of Quesnel, wasn't on the map in 1858 when the first wave of gold miners hit the Fraser River, downstream from the Caribou. But in 1862, Billy Barker made his big strike on Williams Creek. Barker's claim yielded 124 ounces of gold in the first 10 hours. Soon, the hills and waterways were swarmed by gold diggers, many who'd already exhausted claims down on the Fraser or in the California rush back in '48. A town named in Barker's honor, complete with saloons and gambling halls, soon found a place on the map. Things were good in Barkerville, and they got better when the Caribou Wagon Road came in 1865. Now, you could get here from Vancouver in only a week by stage and steamship. The stagecoaches in Barkerville have been busy lately, full of passengers from the 21st century. Friendly bunch, always keen to join in local festivities. They're curious, too. Most are surprised when Mr. Patello tells them the Great Fire of 1868 started when a lovesick miner tried to steal a kiss from an unwilling lady.
Put his arms around her, startled. She threw her arms up, and in the ensuing kerfuffle, somehow the stovepipe was knocked down. A fountain of sparks leapt up, igniting the canvas ceiling and the shake roof above that. From building to building, very quickly the fire spread. In 1 hour and 20 minutes, the town lay a smoking ruin.
As tragedies often do, the fire enkindled a spirit of survival, uniting the citizens in a common challenge to build a new town, this time with proper planning and fire protection. In 6 weeks, more than 90 new buildings rose like a phoenix from the ashes. Barkerville was back on the map. But as the gold was depleted, people moved on to more promising places. Barkerville's heyday was over by the late 1880s. And when the turn of the century came, Barkerville opted to stay behind. Barkerville today is not a museum of replicated Victorian buildings, but an authentic gold rush town as it was in the late 19th century. Out-of-towners are immersed in the history of Barkerville and the Caribou. They discover it was a surprisingly cosmopolitan settlement, with a resident doctor and a library that held over 500 books. The general stores had nearly everything for day-to-day life at the edge of the Canadian frontier. The pharmacy, a few doors up, was equally well stocked. Barkerville's Anglican minister preached in a saloon before St. Saviour's opened in 1870. All of the church's woodwork and many of the furnishings are original. The stained glass window was added in 1949. Sunday services are still held at St. Saviour's. A look inside some of the houses reveals the contrast between the Spartan existence of a bachelor gold miner and the lifestyle of Gold Commissioner John Bowron and his family. Elegant finishings and late Victorian detail are hallmarks of several Barkerville buildings. Traditional vocations carry on in Barkerville. Blacksmiths at Cameron and Ames keep horses well shod and forge nails and iron products. The building that houses the wheelwright and blacksmithing shops was built after the town's original smithy was torn down in the 1930s. A character known as Li Chong tells visitors that some Chinese-Canadian families have been in the Caribou for several generations.
Bill Hong's father, Wang Wen-ga, came here in 1880s, brought his wife, and started family. And now their family is fifth generation.
There's nothing temporary about Barkerville's Chinatown. It was one of the largest in Western Canada. Wally's business evolved from a washhouse to a retail store. Among other items, Wally sold rice, porcelain, liquor, and opium. Over on Williams Creek at the Sheepskin Claim, Mr. Daniel Grimsby, the shift boss, is putting the Cornish wheel in motion. Mr. Michael McKenna, who owns the mine, is extolling the virtues of natural energy to potential investors.
Once we have that wheel in motion, we have access to a great source of power. A great source of power indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, the Cornish water wheel!
With water in the sluices, the audience is invited to unearth a few nuggets. A surefire strategy to loosen their purses.
Ah, look at that, ladies and gentlemen. Beautiful nuggets coming out of our mine.
They're absolutely beautiful.
You invest in this operation, you'll be pulling these out by the bootful. I guarantee it.
Not everyone is convinced. Many prefer to take their risks where the stakes aren't as high. Patience, practice, and a bit of gold panner's luck usually brings a fair return. Out of the summer heat, there's first-class entertainment inside the Theatre Royal.
Yes, sad to say we ran out of the deluxe celestial harmony cast and had to stuff them into the much shorter Paradise Return one.
Members of the Caribou Amateur Dramatic Association have played to full houses in Barkerville since 1865, often relating local lore and history through their musical reviews. Audiences might join the Fools family on a rhythmic stroll up Fraser's Canyon.
It's all part of upholding the Fool family tradition. It's this sort of foolish thinking that has gotten us to where we are today.
Which is lost.
We're not lost, Nicola. We are simply in a new phase of exploration. Water's room deep, close to free to frenzy. Your bench on road, but never your memory roll on. Fraser's River roll on. Fraser's River roll on.
Of course, it's not all singing and dancing at Barkerville. That's only part of it.
While Barkervillians were sluicing the last nuggets from the Caribou Creeks, entrepreneur Charles Hayes was persuading Canada's Prime Minister to fund his grand scheme for BC's North Coast. All he needed was a railway to Tidewater, where he'd build a deep-sea port rivaling Vancouver. It would be named for a cousin of King Charles II, Prince Rupert. Though Hayes' plan survived, Hayes did not. He went down with the Titanic in 1912. In the early 1900s, the western terminus of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railroad would be here, transforming this collection of early settlers into the planned town of Prince Rupert on BC's northwest coast. Eastward construction of the railway began from Prince Rupert in 1908. Supplies were brought up the coast by ship and transported by train and sternwheeler to the track construction sites. Crews laid track east to Mile 100 and on to Kitsilus and Hazelton. In June of 1911, the first passenger train to leave Prince Rupert headed up the Skeena River for Mile 100. In anticipation of the opening of the railway, the building of the town of Prince Rupert continued apace, blasting and carving a town out of solid rock, sometimes a little too close to the rail yard. As the town grew, the sternwheeler Port Simpson and others transported goods and people up the Skeena River and along the nearby coast. The waterfront moved towards completion, and hotels like the Prince Rupert Inn, the hotel owned by the Grand Trunk Pacific on Center Street, housed visiting financial backers and railway moguls. Finally, the GTP brass rode the rails to Fraser Lake, where on the 5th of April, 1914, they witnessed the connecting up of steel and the driving of the last spike. Later, the same month, when the first through train arrived in Prince Rupert from Winnipeg, the whole town was out to celebrate their long-awaited status as the western terminus of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. Prince Rupert was an unusual northern town with an innovative layout, interesting architecture, a wide array of stores, and well-appointed hotels, like the Queen's Hotel and the new Premier Hotel behind. Hardly was Prince Rupert on the map than its role as a transportation hub was overshadowed by the First World War. The Premier Hotel was used as a barracks for the Irish Fusiliers as the men marshaled to prepare for war in August of 1914. Shipping out to the war front in Europe, many of the town's young men would sadly not return. Those at home assisted in the war effort, gathering and shipping sphagnum moss, whose antibiotic properties were put to use dressing wounds. Prince Rupert celebrated the end of World War I with a parade down Main Street and looked forward to a brighter future. Post-1918, the town began to grow again and to complete the unique street plan laid out by Boston architects Brett and Hall. Roads replaced boardwalks and cars the old horse carts. 3rd Avenue became a bustling downtown. Waterfront expansion in the 20s included this 28-acre dry dock complex, a ship shed with its overhanging roof, a large powerhouse, foundries, and welding stalls. In 1919, the Canadian government placed the Grand Trunk Railroad into receivership. It has operated ever since as part of the Canadian National Railway. The railway has continued to play a key role in the development of Prince Rupert to the present day. Into the 1930s, the city continued to develop with new stores on 3rd Avenue and other businesses around town. During World War II, the dry dock ran around the clock, when more than 900 vessels were outfitted for war. In all, 2 minesweepers, 13 10,000-ton freighters, and many smaller ships were built here. Fortifications were erected on the hills around the town, and access to the harbor was controlled by the military. Thousands of Canadian and U.S. military personnel, equipment, and high explosives were all routed through Prince Rupert to various Pacific areas. Fishing was the mainstay of the economy of Northwest Coast First Nations, and in its early years, it was the only aspect of Prince Rupert's in which First Nations participated directly. It was to become a foundation of Prince Rupert's economy as well.
At the height of the fishing industry, there were 18 canneries operating. The first fishing boats were sailboats, towed to the fishing grounds where their gill nets were set to catch salmon. Later, these boats were powered by small gas engines. As the fishing industry became more diversified, boat styles became almost as numerous as boats, and the fishing industry would thrive here in Prince Rupert until the last few years of the 20th century.
On the opposite end of the coast from Prince Rupert, British Columbia's Government House looks out to sea from a hilltop in Victoria's fashionable Rockland neighborhood. The official residence of the Lieutenant Governor, our vice-regal representative. Now, this is where visiting kings and queens are welcomed to the capital city, where premiers seek permission to create provincial governments, where outstanding achievements are recognized, and where BC's living past is revealed in established traditions.
Confederation Day festivities on the grounds of Government House. An annual garden party held in July recognizing British Columbia's 1871 union with Canada. Music of all kinds. A food fair inviting participants to take a bite of Victoria. An assortment of displays and tours of the mansion are just some of the day's activities. Once inside Government House, visitors are drawn into the history of British Columbia. The mansion serves as the official office and residence of the Lieutenant Governor, as well as providing accommodations for visiting dignitaries. The estate is situated on a hilltop near downtown Victoria, with a commanding view of Juan de Fuca Strait. The present building is the fourth on this site. The original residence, built in 1852, burnt down after only 3 months. It was rebuilt as Carey Castle for George Hunter Carey, Attorney General of BC and Vancouver Island. In 1871, when BC entered Confederation, Carey Castle became Government House. Fire struck again in 1899, destroying the house. In 1903, BC architect Samuel McClure, along with Francis Rattenbury, designed a new residence. Once more, in 1957, a fire consumed all but the distinctive porte-cochere in the front of the building. This remaining feature was incorporated into the present house, which was opened in 1959. The Lieutenant Governor is the Canadian Crown's representative in the province. In the early years, the office was one of liaison with the federal government to ensure conformity of provincial and federal legislation. Today, the Lieutenant Governor's role as Chief Executive Officer of the province brings with it a close association to the provincial government. Duties include opening and closing sessions of the legislature, the reading of the throne speech, and swearing in of cabinet members. One of the more important responsibilities is to ensure the province has a government and a premier as leader of that government. In the event of the death or resignation of a premier, or defeat in either an election or in the legislature of a government, it falls to the Lieutenant Governor to make sure those posts are filled. The lush grounds of Government House are open to the public year-round, from sunrise to sunset, and wheelchair pathways throughout the gardens allow for increased access to this popular green space. With the exception of New Year's Day and the Confederation Day celebrations, the house itself is open to the public by invitation only. Every January 1st, the Lieutenant Governor hosts a New Year's levee, a long-standing tradition where the community is invited inside the house to exchange New Year's greetings with the Lieutenant Governor and the chatelaine.
And here is a Canada pin for you. And a Happy New Year.
Janice LeCoupe.
Happy New Year, ma'am. Nice to see you.
The Music at Government House concert series has also become a popular way to make Government House more accessible. As a center of hospitality for the government, recognition and award ceremonies are held at Government House on a regular basis. The kitchen is kept busy preparing meals ranging from small formal dinners to large gatherings. An ornate dining room, the heart of which is an elegant mahogany table, is the setting for many state functions. Larger gatherings like this Christmas luncheon for the Friends of Government House Garden Society are held in the ballroom. The Friends Christmas Luncheon is an annual event in recognition of the many hours dedicated to the Government House Gardens, a Vancouver Island showpiece. Government House has a variety of enthusiastic volunteer groups including archivists, flower arrangers, and tour guides. More than a building, Government House is an embodiment of the tradition and history of lieutenant governors past, a symbol of the Canadian democratic system, and a valuable part of British Columbia's heritage.
Traditional celebrations like Confederation Day are reminders of occasions that shaped the future of British Columbia. But BC's living past isn't just political milestones. Who could forget 1915, when the Vancouver Millionaires won the Stanley Cup, or the Miracle Mile in 1954 at Empire Stadium? One sporting event that draws 2,500 spectators to the southern interior every June has been making BC history since 1988. Though we often think of our heritage as something that occurred centuries ago, we tend to forget that what happens today is history tomorrow. And as Canadian commentator Robert Fulford suggests, events that get stored in our living past invariably influence our future. As recently as 2005, Fulford said, "History thickens daily existence and gives life meaning by linking us with chains of ancestors. History, if understood even a little, becomes the background against which we enact our lives." It's common for us to uphold social or political turning points as the cornerstones of our history, but with help from our partners in knowledge who fund our BC Moments, we see history being made in the day-to-day lives of ordinary British Columbians. Personally, I share the view of historian Joyce Beaton. In 1990, she commented, "I still say the history of Canada is in shoeboxes under people's beds." I'm Malcolm Stewart. Thanks for joining us.